Professor Ramesh, Mr. Shekhar Vishwanathan, Professor Manoj, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. At the outset, I am extremely grateful to Professor Ramesh and IIM Bangalore for organizing this event. To be honest with you, I didn't want a formal release of the book ever. And therefore, even when the publishers wanted to organize an event, I was quite shy of doing it. And the reason was very simple, that this is a subject which ingrains a philosophy. And you can't stand up and say, hey, this is my philosophy. Would you like to practice it? But Professor Ramesh is such a dear friend, and we have been on the board together. He talks very modestly about himself. I know how much of contribution he makes to the National Insurance Academy. In fact, I'm not letting out a secret. When we were rewriting the vision and mission document of NIA, he and I were in that small committee of 3 persons. So when he says that, oh, he keeps listening to me, that's not correct. But nonetheless, I'm indeed grateful to him, and I couldn't refuse. But I'm glad that I'm here and that this formal launch of the book is being done in an educational institution like IIM Bangalore. In fact, corporate governance is a word which is used, abused, and talked about more than any other word in the corporate world is being talked about. But somewhere along the line, the philosophical part, or what exactly it means, is being lost in the din of the regulatory framework, the legislative provisions, and the endless debates, and the professionals who keep pontificating about the practices that should be observed to create a corporate governance framework, value of emulation. And therefore, let me go back to the basics. My book starts just about 2 pages from where the concept of economics started. That is hunting and gathering, to agricultural economy, to industrial economy, to information economy, to the onset of bioeconomy. And I hazard a guess of the opening of the next, audaciously enough, that the next real driver of planet Earth will be cosmic economy. And then I try to elucidate how these economies started growing. And it was sometime in the 16th and 17th centuries when a great financial and economic innovation took place, which has not been noticed or at least talked about in the world as much, is the creation of a joint stock company. The people with surplus resources were allowed to join hands with people with ideas and the entrepreneurship. And together, they wanted to create value or the wealth out of the resources used during that enterprise business. And therefore, the basic concept, and if you see where from started, even though the fundamental history I've quoted in the book is, for the first time in the world, something like 95 shares of the Belus Mining Company were transacted in Toulouse, France in 1250. But it eventually evolved during the 16th and 17th centuries when the sailors in search of riches wanted the risk to be spread around. And therefore they started inviting people who had wealth that come, engage with us, we will create wealth and we'll share with you. And that's where when initially the companies started with charters. I was telling Mr. Manoj that somewhere in the late 17th century and the beginning of 18th century, India was supposed to be a very prosperous country. Would you believe, it is written in the book, that almost all the European countries from where the sailors were taking to the high seas, the first important company that was registered was East India Company Limited. It was registered in UK, it was registered in Spain, it was registered in Portugal. Someone may ask me a question, particularly from the younger generation, then what happened to our wealth? Well, it got eroded, it got carted away, it was looted. And also it was not created further. Now, and therefore the fundamental purpose of the innovation of a joint stock company was the creation of wealth. And the management of that created wealth and its efficacious sharing among all those stakeholders. And who were the stakeholders? The stakeholders were the people who were the entrepreneurs, or the guys who were prepared to take the risk, the people who were pooling in the financial resources or otherwise, the state. Because initially the joint stock companies started as chartered companies, and they were basically, particularly in England and Europe, they were basically meant to finance their war activities and create colonies, because the state did not have adequate resources. But the eventual purpose of the governments of those countries was to create wealth. And therefore, the prime purpose of starting a joint stock company was wealth creation. And having created, wealth has to be managed appropriately and has to be shared sagaciously. Now here enters the drama. The great economist Adam Smith first deciphered the problem of agency. That if someone has the right to manage the interests of someone else, he or she is likely to create some interest for himself or herself. And therefore, certain broader framework has to be created to ensure that agency problem does not hinder the ultimate objective for which the enterprise is created. And that is how the barriers to the good corporate governance started. I have listed in my book what are those barriers, but let me just mention to you what happens if someone is managing somebody's business. First, the interest of the two, those inactive stakeholders and the active stakeholders, may vary. And as a consequence of which, he in the driver's seat may profit therefrom. Then similarly, abuse of opportunity, abuse of authority. And there are a number of other barriers. I mean, you can go on endlessly. As I was telling in the class that I was addressing short while ago, well, I have been sitting on the boards, good fortune of having sat on the boards for good over 3.5 decades. And I have seen how various barriers stand up to good corporate governance. Then therefore came in what is called a regulatory state into the picture. And that's how the formation of legislation to ensure that the problem of agency does not hinder the basic fundamental purpose. And naturally, frames were created. Now, I don't want to go into the details of those frames, but I would like to tell you with every corporate governance scandal or a serious misconduct, these frameworks go on refinement. And therefore, the corporate governance framework is always on a boiling pot. It has not settled yet. Something happening in the United States, something happening in Europe, or something happening in Japan or South Korea, it just goes back to frames. And those frames have 4 broad pillars according to me. One, the related party transactions, because someone in authority has a chance to abuse his power, to utilize the opportunity, to make personal gains or make somebody else to gain about it. The second is the following of the accounting standard. Now the purpose which I have defined in my book, the purpose of following the accounting standard is that anyone who looks at the financial statement of a company must be able to understand as the writers of those statements understand. The analyst who opine on the performance of the organization or the future of the organization should be able to understand. And therefore, certain standards have to be laid down. And that is why accounting standards have been laid down. And that's why it is also put down the frame itself. Any time you are changing that standard, you must give a public notice. And also state in the footnote the impact of that change. The whole idea is that anyone who has or who does read the statement should be able to understand as the CFO of a company would or as the CEO of the company would. Then comes the disclosure. Now, well, it's known that transparency is the best mechanism to exercise the discretion. And if there is no transparency, then the discretion can be exercised by people. And therefore, the fourth pillar, which is not as much in details written, but the rules are there, is the boardroom practices. And those boardroom practices start with the structure of the board itself, the quarterly meetings, the committees of the board, the responsibilities of the board committees, the responsibility of the board, and how the board will proceed and all those kind of things. Now, this is the broad framework which has been created. And as a consequence of which, and as I said, the continuous refinement of those framework remains on a boiling pot. Now, this particular framework is validated at the 4 levels. The first validation is by the management itself. The management, of course, consists of the Chief Compliance Officer, the CFO, the CEO, who give a certificate that yes, our corporate governance norms have been fully observed in letter and spirit. Then comes the board committees. And then comes the auditors, then comes the board committee, and then the board. These are the 4 layers through which the observance of those all frames of corporate governance, which is laid down in regulations, legislation, by directions, guidance, is to be observed. Unfortunately, because of the variety as well as the enormity of this framework, corporate governance is being confused with the observance of the framework alone. And the ultimate purpose for which the corporate is created, the ultimate purpose for the stakeholders join up with the entrepreneurs or the executive management to be part of the organization is lost. And what is that? Wealth creation. There is no formal method by which wealth is assessed. Whether, for example, and I write in my book that the resources of the planet Earth are limited, including those which are renewable assets. Now, in case they are limited, then they must be passed on to such people who can optimally create wealth out of those resources. And therefore, the markets have been created. And it is believed that even though markets are not the perfect allocator of the resources, they are possibly the best allocator of the resources in the current social system that we live. Now, there is no appraisal. And therefore, when I was what I used to describe jokingly, in the chair of the pontiff of the regulation of the market, I laid down, at least voluntarily, you must have corporate governance rating. And I have given the details in the book that corporate governance, in fact, it took me quite a while to inspire both CRISIL as well as ICRA to do the rating, because they felt this is not going to be a great revenue resource. I said, look, guys, sometimes initially you start with a social service and then make an economic service. You'll be able to do that. Unfortunately, because there has been no serious insistence, it has not become a revenue source. But it does envisage the wealth creation, wealth management, and wealth sharing. Now, the point I was making was that corporate governance, and which is what, in fact, half of my book is devoted, more than half of the book is devoted to boardroom practices. And where do the boardroom practices begin with? There is a confusion that I can have wonderful people on the board. Now, it's my belief that you need to have wonderful people on the board. Variety of skills, from variety of geographies, and variety of experiences. But in case you do not make use of that talent, they become an artifact in the boardroom. You hang wonderful pictures, no? Now, what is needed to be done is that the executive management must prepare for a board meeting, and that begins the journey from creation of a proper board agenda. Now, board agenda, for example, in the case of a company which I happen to chair, I insist that in case you are asking for allocation of additional financial resources for a new project, you will have to give me options. That whether I create an organic new factory, or I buy out a factory, and if I do this or I do this, what are the various options? Now, unless the executive management tries to utilize the talent in the board, ladies and gentlemen, can you tell me there can be optimal creation of wealth? And that is the appraisal. Of course, SEBI has gone one step further, including the companies that have the provisions about the, what is called appraisal of the performance of the board members and the committees. But that again has landed in the ritual. My philosophical underpinning is all that the review you do, certainly you do all that preparation for doing a puja, but ultimately do some meditation also and establish some communion with the God, and that God, in the case of a giant stock company, is the wealth creation, wealth management, wealth sharing. Now, how it can be done? First and foremost, I have tried to define what is the role of the board and what is the role of executive management. Those of you who have an opportunity to sit on the board see, in fact, despite the fact that in some of the boards where I am not the chairman, I keep on pushing, but 90% of the time is spent in replicating what management does. Only about 5-10% of the time is spent on what board is supposed to do. For example, if you sit in a board meeting, those routine items starting from leave of absence, confirmation of minutes, action taken report, compliance certificates, declarations, all that goes on. And finally comes review of the performance of the company for the quarter. And CEO and CFO stand up to make a wonderful presentation. Half an hour, 45 minutes gone. Very scant discussions take place. And there comes the time for the lunch and the tea and the board. Well, my dear friends, if that is what is to be done, then why do we need to have a board? Why do we need to have those wonderful, great, experienced, learned people on the board at all? If we want wisdom of the gray hairs or even the black hairs, these days we are also trying to, if at all we have a process to be incited, younger people on the board. Because my belief, a good board comprises, and that's what I write in the book, a good board comprises of youth and maturity. Because youth has the ability of risk-taking. Maturity has a sense of proportion. And when they join together, the decision-making in the boardroom is going to be much more superior. It may not still guarantee that the best value will be created of the decision taken, but it will certainly assure all those who are decision makers that we try to think through, we try to do. The real challenge in most board is there is no democracy in the board. Chairman says something, in fact, I have quoted the instance. Deliberately, I have not written the name of the company because I don't want to annoy anybody. My purpose of writing stories in the book is not to cast aspersions on A, B, C, or D. I write in the book that in one board we were 11 members. And the way the board meeting used to go on, after second board meeting, something was there, and I had a chance to humorize the board. I said, in this 11-member team, there is one single batsman. And the chairman didn't understand, even though very bright individual, very famous man. I said, Chairman. Then he laughed, because 95% of the time, Chairman used to talk. In the 5% time, 3% was given to CEO, and 2% was given to, 1% was given to company secretary for reading that agenda, only 1% was given. The point I'm making is the preparation of the boardroom meeting, what is happening in the boardroom has to be. Now, coming back to the point that I left and digressed deliberately was what is the role of the board and what is the role of executive management. It's well defined. The board role is the direction of the company. Board role is this, defining the strategy of the company. And therefore, there are clear-cut, I have outlined in my book, two loops, strategy loop and the performance loop. In the strategy loop, the board has to define what is the vision of the company, what is the mission of the company, what kind of values will be practiced in the company, what kind of culture will be enshrined, and then what are the strategic frame, how the input mobilization will take place, what kind of geographies will address, what kind of customer population will address, and how will address. All these is called strategic frames. This board will define, of course, with the help of management. Management will do the background work, bring about the propositions, and also suggest, if possible, the alternatives. And these agendas must circulate in advance so that the board has time to apply itself and then come and debate. The second is called a performance loop. And in the performance loop will be, first, the board will define what are my value creation goals. For example, in this particular year, how much of additional enterprise value will be added? Board has to define the management. You just can't say, oh, give me 10% growth. Give me 20% growth. But what if you have a top line and there's no bottom line? As I have used the word, I'm sure some of you, they say top line is sexy, but bottom line is the ecstasy. And ultimately, the company exists for bottom line. And therefore, the goal of value creation has to be defined by the board. And then superintendence of the execution by the management. The role of the management is to execute the policies given and deliver the value creation goals. Management is not, in fact, I have seen in one board, vision was being rewritten and something ragtag was brought to the board. And before, I was still trying to look through what was written. The agenda paper came only previous night. Before I could even flip through on my iPad, the vision was approved and gone. When I woke up, I said, what is this? Arey? Mr. CEO, you do not have the authority. No, sir, we have debated ourselves. We have decided this will be the vision of the company. I said, what do you mean? You have decided. It's the board which will decide. Do you know who owns the company? Shareholders. How do the shareholders manage? They appoint a set of few individuals, honorable individuals, men and women, as the board members. They have the first authority. And you guys can operate anything which board has the authority only if the board decides to give you the authority. And therefore, my book deals with how to utilize the talent of the board and various facets I have given. What kind of notes should be prepared, how the agenda should be written, how the minutes should be prepared, how the action taken report should be taken, how they should have a continuous flow of information, not only about the company, but also about the competitors, about the macroeconomic environment, socio-political environment, and how they are going to create some kind of fusion of all the factors together and impact on the future of this company. And unless this kind of education, this kind of support is provided to the board, how do you expect that the board will be able to deliver its responsibility of providing the strategic vision to the company? And how to evaluate? I have quoted two methodologies which are not mine. One is, of course, economic value addition. As you know, that famous two authors have written a book, and I have said there should be economic value addition appraisal at the end of each financial year. Suppose board had given, you will add 100 crore to the enterprise value through the economic value addition, whether you have created 90 crore or 50 crore or 20 crore or 120 crore or 150 crore. The second methodology is simple, which is called market value addition. And market value addition is, if you are a listed company, or even if you are not listed, there is a method by which you can evaluate the enterprise value. Yes, suppose 1st of April, you had the enterprise value of 10,000 crore, and on 1st of April next year, you have an enterprise value of 11,000 crore. 1,000 crore has been added to the value. And we should see what happened. And then my methodology, which I have suggested myself, is a mixture of both. I'm saying that economic value addition should be the floor, and market value addition should be a reflection. And then you try to moderate what happened, various factors that played out against your company, which are beyond the control, including the risk management, which is the responsibility of the board to do that. And once this appraisal is done, then only you should say whether, because in that appraisal, I am also recommending for the consideration that if board had suggested certain strategies, and if those strategies were followed in letter in the spirit, and if they have not succeeded, board must evaluate that whether that decision was right or not. And if it was not right, whether did they undertake the course correction or not. Now, unless such an evaluation takes place, what is the purpose of corporate governance? The purpose of corporate governance, or the corporate itself, is wealth creation. And then I've also given methodologies, what normally happens in management. Of course, I mean, brief, very brief, because I didn't want to dwell into managing an enterprise. I've also given various methods how you can calculate the wealth sharing, because wealth sharing has been a question which has been debated very heatedly. The CEO takes away, in fact, you must have read the examples of CEO even while walking out also have taken X amount of wealth of the company. Unfairly, those in some cases, may not be in some cases. But I have given methodologies, my own assessment, how you can do that. And at the end of it, I have suggested certain corporate governance principles and certain philosophies. And there are simple 3 principles and 3 philosophies. The principles are basically that you must have transparency, you must have accountability, and you must have appreciation of the efforts. And the methodologies that you do is equality of treatment, all those kind of things are there. I don't want to go on and on, but I would like to suggest for your consideration that whenever and wherever you have an occasion to either sit on the board or appraise the performance of the board or a company, please do not look from the myopic glasses of just seeing whether conformance to the rules or the framework laid down by the regulators and or the legislation has been observed in letter or not. Go back beyond it and see what has happened to the utilization resources that were commanded by the board and the executive management in the ultimate creation of the wealth and its sharing. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.